Thank you for joining the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston for our weekly online ministers forum. I'm the Reverend Dr. Colin Bossen, Senior Minister of the congregation. These programs are conversations with community organizers, scholars, religious leaders, artists, and others about how we can collectively address the present crises. Their purpose is to offer members of our community and all who wish to join us online science-based resources and liberation-oriented inspiration to get us through these difficult times. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Hejar Oncel. We'll be talking about Rojava in northern Syria and the Kurdish struggle. Dr. Oncel grew up as a Kurd in Turkey right across the border from the city of Kobani in Rojava. That city became famous throughout the world in 2014 because of its heroic resistance to DAESH. Dr. Oncel is the co-founder and executive vice president of the Kurdish American Foundation of Houston. He earned a Ph.D. in mechanical engineering from the University of Houston. We hope that you find these forums a source of connection, hope, and clarity in these challenging times. Hejar, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me over, Colin.
So I think that a lot of people probably don't even know what Rojava is or where it is, and I think that if you could just start out by kind of like offering us that most basic sort of geographic and historical orientation, it would be super helpful.
Yeah, definitely. Some of your audience members may not be familiar with the long history of Kurdistan being divided into four pieces. Historically, Kurdistan is at the heart of the Middle East in a mountainous area, and today it's divided among four countries. The largest piece is in Turkey, then Iran, northern Iraq, and northeastern Syria. In terms of the size, we are talking about size of Florida if we compare it to US, but it's divided into four of these countries. Although we all speak the same language and similar dialects, and we have ties to each other through families and history, this borders were causing a lot of troubles to Kurdish nation for many decades in 1900s and then in this century as well. Rojava specifically means in Kurdish west, and the reason we call Syrian Kurdistan as the west because it's the westernmost piece of Kurdish territories. Today, it covers a landmass close to 1/4 of the United Kingdom, and it's across the border between Syria, Iraq, and Turkey. And historically, the Kurds in Syria and the Kurds in Iraq and the Kurds in Turkey have always been very close due to the Ottoman Empire. They lived together for more than 600 years under the same empire. But with the Sykes-Picot Agreement between Britain and France, 1916, and at the end of World War I, 1918, Kurds, what we call the south of the border, the Iraqi and the Syrian Kurds, were separated from the Kurds and what was left from Ottoman Empire, which is today's Turkey. So yeah, that's in short how all the Kurds are very well connected to the little piece of Kurdistan in Syria, Rojava. But on the other hand, how historically and with family ties and language and culture, we are very well connected. A lot of poets and writers and authors and movie makers from Rojava, Kurdistan, their pieces, their art pieces are followed by Kurds from all four parts. Historically, if we come to the very recent history, when the protests started against the ruling Ba'ath party in Syria against Bashar al-Assad's government, what Kurds did, we offered the third path. We said no to Assad's government's oppressive methods, and we also said no to the mostly Sunni Arab opposition that was forming against Assad government based on the religious grounds. So we offer the third path, and we call this democratic confederalism. We can talk a little bit about it later, but the idea is basically we will neither follow one extreme ideology, and nor we will not also be oppressed by this government. So we start to organize bottom up in our neighborhoods, in our villages, among the committees, to show an alternate form of government to Syrian people, which is open to all ethnic groups, which is open to all people that would like to join the democratic, free society that values ecology and gender equality. So that was really the basic tenets. If you respect women, if you respect nature, if you respect democracy, come and help us build this third way in northern part of Syria as an alternate model to what Assad is pushing or what the other opposition groups are proposing. And unfortunately, this was met by a fierce harsh, I would say, response from the Islamists, and it came to its peak when Daesh, as we call ISIS in the Middle East, started to attack every single town in Rojava. And what they were subduing people to middle age type of tortures and slavery, and unfortunately, they were plundering, killing, like at the Middle Ages level that humanity has not seen during the last 1,000 years. But as the people of Rojava, of all ethnic groups, we put up a harsh resistance against that, with the help and support of international volunteers coming from all over the world as well, to support this very free and democratic model. And that come to its peak, like you were saying, in 2014 when the town of Kobani was um, basically being destroyed by ISIS with their superior firepower, with the guns and equipment that they stole from the Iraqi government, which means they came from the United States to the Iraqi government. Long story short, they had this power to destroy Rojava, but the people of Rojava, with the solidarity of like-minded democracy, peace, and freedom-loving people all around the world, we stood against this tyranny of jihadis and ISIS, and we prevailed. Now we are ruling, like I said, northeastern part of Syria, which is north of the Euphrates River, which is 1/3 of Syria, with this free and democratic model, which is a brand new experiment for the region. The region has never experienced such a progressive idea. It's that progressive that I would say even in Western democracies, it has not been really experimented before. Such a direct democracy, bottom up. You're talking about beyond Swiss democracy model here. It's very hard to make it work in the realities of the region, but people are trying their best to at least adhere to all these principles truly, not just pay a lip service to it. I hope that was comprehensive enough, Colin.
Well, thank you. That was a very thorough and I think extraordinarily helpful overview. I mean, I think there's a few things that I would want to lift up or highlight that you just said. One of which is that this is this extraordinarily exciting, different democratic model that, I mean, really, the only sort of equivalent place that I can think of in the world that has had anything that's similar to it is in Chiapas with the Zapatistas. And I think that one of the things that you didn't mention that I think is really fascinating about both those experiments is that they're both multi-ethnic, and I'd love to hear you kind of talk a little bit more about that in a minute. I mean, Rojava is obviously a Kurdish word and is primarily been led by the Kurds, but I mean, I know there's Yazidis and host Arabs and a number of other ethnic peoples. And I think that that's actually very interesting because I think that pluralistic democracy is really one of the hardest kinds of democracy to pull off. I mean, here in the United States, we have an extraordinarily difficult time with having a multiracial democracy. I mean, if we just look at what happened in the most recent presidential election, I think that that's just very clear. But before we get into the kind of the demographic composition and stuff like that, I'd love to hear you talk a bit more about the feminism and the ecological angle of democratic confederalism, because I think that both of those are actually quite different than what we would experience in a place like the United States. And also if you could like maybe provide a really just concrete example of the grassroots democracy in action, I think that would be also really appreciated.
Um, so I would like to just talk a little bit about the model, the democratic confederalism model, and give some further details on that. So the model has three main pillars. One is called democratic society, democratic communities. This pillar is based on the idea that there are multiple peoples that live in Rojava, multiple ethnic or ethno-religious groups. And all the groups, if they call themselves separate, they are respected as separate groups. Given the history of the region, we have a lot of ethnic groups that live in Rojava today. Armenians, Assyrians, Turkmens, Sunni Arabs, Shia Arabs, naturally Kurds, and many other ethnic groups. So allowing all these groups form neighborhood communities. And it's very similar to the model suggested by the very famous American political theoretician Murray Bookchin, like the libertarian municipalism model. All the society is basically built bottom up through communities, and all the decision making starts at the lowest grassroots level. And whatever the lower committees decide, the upper committees' role is just to make sure that that's elevated to the top level. And if there's any planning that needs to happen to help these people run their own matters, then that's about it. Other than that, don't interfere, let people live in their own way, which allows all the different ethnic groups, all the different religious groups to preserve the way they live, to preserve the languages, the ancient languages that are about to die in the region because of the monolithic understanding of oppressive regimes that have been pushing either Arabization or Turkification or you name it. So this is definitely, I would say, like a flower, like a tree in the middle of a desert, an oasis in the middle of a desert that gives hope to people, which makes it unique. But the more important piece, and I want to also add one more thing, that what we have been seeing in Rojava is very similar to what we have seen in Spanish Civil War and in Barcelona. A lot of international volunteers coming with the ideas of republicanism, not in the sense in America, but believe in a republic versus an oppressive tyrant or a king. People that believe in democracy, an egalitarian society, grassroots democracy, they all come to Rojava to make this model work. Like scientists come to teach at the universities. Theoreticians come to actually turn their ideas into grassroots movements. Engineers come to help us rebuild Rojava altogether. So this was really, really amazing. And like almost like George Orwell, who went to Spanish Civil War, wrote 1984 and all that. So it's similar. A lot of intellectuals are coming and then they're writing books. And I think that it's going to be like 30, 40 years from today, we're going to have a lot of famous authors that will be proud that they helped the Rojava revolution flourish. The two other elements of democratic confederalism on top of the libertarian municipalism / democratic nation I was talking about is the absolute gender equality and ecological society. And what do I mean by that? Every single decision-making body must consist 50% of women. That's one. Number two, women can veto the co-chair. Let's say you have two chair people. Co-chair woman can veto men. Men cannot veto women. So that creates basically an environment where women's voice cannot be silenced. And you are doing that in towns that are liberated from DAESH. Let me give you a very concrete example. In the town of El-Shaddadi, when ISIS, DAESH, as we name them in the region, was kicked out by Rojava forces, the first thing that happened was the female resistance groups. There are female resistance groups who do not take orders from male generals. The entire chain of command is women. In case men change their mind and want to oppress women, these will be the fighters that will stand against the misogyny or patriarchal society, and they're also fighting to liberate their lands, their own homeland. Doesn't matter which ethnic group they are. They came to the town of El-Shaddadi, which actually half of the town was sympathetic to ISIS, to be honest. They didn't touch any of the locals. All they said, you must send all your women to an elementary school because we're going to form our own women group, and we're going to choose elected officials to run the town. It was so counter to the ideology or to the way the people grew up that they didn't want to send the women. So these women had to go to the homes of, knock on every door with their guns and say, all we want is your women to show up in the school. And then they elected women co-chair, co-mayor, and this was like unheard of in the region. And it was such a big change, when you think of it, that it was mind-blowing for a lot of people. And in that town right now, actually, a lot of the things are being run by women. Like after 5 years, that happened like 5 years ago. So it's huge changes that are taking place in the region that is unheard of. And even in the United States today, we do not have 50% women quota. Senate is not 50%. House of Reps is not 50%. We are nowhere close that. In Rojava, that's 50% at every level. It's really mind-blowing. And I think it needs to be supported and cheered, especially the fact that it's taking place in a region where women actually were the most oppressed, I would say. And then the third element of the democratic confederalism is ecological society. So people in the region understand one thing very well. Water is a big problem. And most of the wars, actually, one of the top reasons behind that is who controls the rivers, who controls the water. So, and unfortunately, the climate change is impacting the region so bad that one of the main drivers of Syrian civil war is the big drought that happened between 2004 and 2011. 7 years of drought at the biblical levels, and it's 7 years, right? It's interesting. And right after that, Syrian like output of like the grains declined by 20%, but population during that 7 years increased almost 70%. They were having a lot of children. That was one of the main drivers of the war. Naturally, there's a lot of ideological divides and many other things, but scarcity of resources. So people do understand that. And people of the region, we also understand that one of the main drivers behind it is the carbon emissions done by large corporations, big countries, and they do not want to curb that. Even the Paris Accord, we also like, it's not really bringing any concrete results. So people do understand that in Rojava, and as everything is being built from scratch after the destruction of the war, bottom up, with the communities that are coming together at the lowest level, new co-ops start to be formed. Women-only co-ops, survivors of the ISIS violence, whose villages all the men were killed, only women survived. New co-ops start to form. They are ruling themselves. It's a little bit similar to kibbutz model in Israel, but it's further than that. But the most important thing is it has to be done, agriculture needs to be done with sustainable methods. So people are finding sustainable methods to irrigate their land, use basically animal-only fertilizers, basically going back to what we had, and like seed banks. A lot of the seed banks send seeds to Rojava. The reason being is all these GMO, genetically modified seeds that are being used here in the U.S. or even in Turkey, in Saudi Arabia, and all these big countries, and they are coming from big corporations, and then they are basically sterile grains. You cannot reuse them. You have to pay big companies over and over again. So people ask for these ancient grains that were stored in Norway, in Svalbard Island, somewhere close to Arctic. They were sent to Rojava so people can use the first grains, because the agricultural revolution in Rojava, basically, the oldest remains of agriculture in humans 10,000 years ago started there, right after the Ice Age. So people are looking for these grains to restart a sustainable way of living, basically. And I think that's also revolutionary, right? In the West, unfortunately, there are small experiments here and there, but that never happened at a land that is 1/4 size of the United Kingdom. And that's what we're seeing flourishing and happening. And that's why it's very important that international community, like-minded people, support this experiment and understand it's not just something based on some ethnic group fighting against another group. It's way more than that. It's a new model that makes sure that there's absolute gender equality. We rebuild our communities through an ecological model so that we are taking care of our nature, and everybody has a voice, no matter how populous your ethnic group is or how small it is, doesn't matter. You have a voice, you have your own committee, and you will be heard.
I mean, it is such a remarkable model, democratic confederalism. And I think that one of the things that, I mean, one of the reasons why I have brought you, because you came to the church back when we were meeting in person, actually did one of the last, you were on a panel that was one of our last sort of in-person forums that people can actually go and watch the video of if you would like to, where we had a couple of other speakers that was quite interesting as well. And that's like a 2-hour conversation. So, you know, you can really get a little bit more of a depth feel for what Hejar is talking about if you want to listen to that forum. But I mean, I think that one of the things that I think is so important is it's clear that right now with the ecological crisis we're in, and within the, frankly, global democratic crisis we're in, that the kind of old models that people have had are no longer really working. I mean, maybe they never worked, and that's a conversation we could have, but clearly they're not working right now. I mean, the United States is at such an impasse that we cannot get basic aid passed at a federal level for the coronavirus pandemic. And so, you know, I think we need to be looking for new models. And a lot of times people will say, well, the system that we have is the only existing system that will work, or the best system that will work. You can't really think beyond that. But I think that one of the things that's so powerful about Rojava and democratic confederalism is that it's thinking beyond the situation we're in, and it's urban, right? I mean, the population we're talking about is what, about 2 million people? And some of the cities, how big is the biggest city in Rojava?
Hasaka is around 800, 900,000. Kamishlo is 600,000, 700,000. So you're talking about 70-75% urbanized society, actually.
Right, and I think that that's extremely important, because when people criticize groups like the Zapatistas as like a particular model of a way that we might think our way or organize our way out of the current mess that we're in, they're like, well, it's a rural community, you can't really scale it up. And the Spanish Civil War, like Barcelona, it was a sort of blip that was there for, I mean, really anarchist Republican Barcelona existed for about 18 months, 2 years, so that's not really a model because it wasn't sustainable. I mean, obviously it was crushed by fascists, but I'm just naming the critique, right? But here in Rojava, I mean, we have large urban communities. Communities are larger than many of the sort of most well-known cities in the United States. I mean, about the same size as a place like Detroit, that are being governed by democratic confederalism. So I think it really points to possibilities beyond where we're at that are more democratic, more feminist, more ecological, and that if we're going to have a different situation as humanity moving forward, we need this kind of inspiration. And so I think it's just super important to have, you know, to highlight conversations like this as much as possible. I want to talk actually a little bit, or invite you to talk a little bit here about the connections, though, between the United States and Rojava, particularly on an intellectual level, because there is this sort of fascinating connection between intellectual traditions in the United States and Rojava. You mentioned this guy named Murray Bookchin, and he influenced, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing his name, Abdullah Öcalan.
Correct.
Who is one of the major theoreticians of the movement in Rojava. So can you talk about that connection a little bit? And I think one reason why I want to bring this up is because a lot of times people think that like intellectual ideas or conversations don't really matter or are too abstract, and yet here's a case where someone was theorizing here in the United States, and his ideas have had this incredible impact over there in northern Syria.
Definitely. So the intellectual evolution of and at the core of the Rojava ideology that is being implemented right now, it's also a little bit of the evolution of the Kurdish freedom movement. Although Rojava itself is a non-ethnic experiment, its nucleus comes from there. And then in that nucleus, the idea was belief in some sort of a leftist leaning movement, but it wasn't 100% defined in any sense. So the theoretician that you mentioned, Mr. Öcalan, what he did, he framed the ideas out of all the possible different leftist options. Murray Bookchin was very influential on him, along with Noam Chomsky. So when you and what Öcalan was trying to do is basically taking that libertarian municipalism model, which is like the core of it is really it's libertarian. It's not an oppressive state sanctioned, state planned type of egalitarian society like you would see in a Soviet model. But also it's grassroots, it's bottom up, which means that it allows you to organize different ethnic groups preserving the way they live in the region. It's even more important than in other parts of the world where you have homogeneous nations and everybody is the same religion, same ethnic group. It's not like that in the region where we are living in. So Murray Bookchin's daughter, she comes and talks at a lot of the events for the emergency relief fund of Rojava, and she is seeing her father's ideas being implemented at this part of the world, and that really, really is exciting for her and for anybody that follow Murray Bookchin. And the reason Murray Bookchin turned his ideology, started as a socialist, but turned into this libertarian model, he saw the horrors of the implementation of socialism happening around the world, and he didn't want that to be repeated. He wanted to be not upside down, top to bottom, but it wanted to be bottom up. And on top of that, Öcalan, from Noam Chomsky's perspective, anarcho-syndicalism also was very influential, although not implemented in every way. The fact that Noam Chomsky was influenced, he went to Israel and lived in a kibbutz and saw how people were organized there. That's how he framed his ideology. And Öcalan saw a lot of things that he can actually take and in a pragmatic way implement in the Rojava model. On top of that, Michel Foucault and Hannah Arendt were very influential against sociologists on the ideology that Öcalan tried to put together for the people to live in this model. And I would say, and then typical left-leaning intellectuals like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels also, and provides some basically frameworks to Murray Bookchin and other intellectuals. But Rosa Luxemburg, Virginia Woolf, you can name a lot more names from the feminist struggle were also very, very influential on him. And I would say almost like when you read his books, you will see that at least 50% of the book is talking about the feminist struggle. It's a lot less about the economic oppression. It's more about the gender oppression, because when you think of it, 50% of the world is still oppressed, and that's how he starts. And he really gives, I would say, hope to the women in the region that they don't need to wait for a gradual change. They can actually make a revolutionary change in people's minds, especially in man's mind, to change the society very quickly. And I think that's one of the main reasons why Rojava Revolution, it's been 9 years now, that it survived despite all the odds, international odds against it, despite none of the superpowers being interested in keeping that experiment alive, and regional powers trying to crush it. It still survives. And the main reason, at least I believe, is because women really did embrace it. Women passed that on to their families and their children, and they see that that's the only model where they can be happy. And at the core of it is really happiness, because any other model that we're seeing around the world, creates misery of masses, different kinds of masses, but misery of masses. And but basically, Öcalan was looking, how can the people be happy with a model that is replicable all around the world? And so that whole connection to intellectuals in the United States that were talking about a libertarian socialism, I find it actually very interesting. So basically, a form of socialism is being imported to Middle East from America. Sounds a little bit of an oxymoron, but it's the reality. So that gives me hope that American people can also see that the same model can be actually replicated here. Why not? Because it's not also contradicting even the Constitution, the current Constitution of the United States. It's all about pursuit of happiness. It's all about freedom. It's all about freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of standing for who you are, openly telling what you want, and freedom of organizing in the way you want. And when you look at the United States, the way it's organized, actually, like at the local levels, even judges are being elected, right? I think it's already giving opportunity to people to choose the right elected officials to put them into place so that they help drive this. You don't even need a direct type of revolution or anything like that in the US. It can be done gradually because the system allows people to vote for the leaders that have the right mindset, and then to organize at the grassroots to create this environment where they can push for more women representation and more ecological solutions.
Well, and I think that one thing that's maybe not been emphasized here, but just kind of came out in what you're talking about, is that this is a non-state centered ideology or a non-state centered movement, and so that it's not democratic confederalism doesn't seek to like seize control of the federal government in the way that say a lot of traditional leftist movements have, but rather says we need to start with grassroots democracy and create democratic experiments at the grassroots level. And if we can create those and sustain those, then those will ultimately transform society.
Thank you so much for emphasizing. I just want to add one thing. The very interesting thing is when like the whole model is based on that, and then that's following Murray Bookchin's ideology anyway. But in the specifics of implementation in Rojava, what Öcalan has been saying was super interesting. And he was saying Rojava model has no problem with the flag of Syrian Ba'ath regime. Rojava, the system doesn't have problem to coexist with that. Rojava system doesn't have problem to coexist even with the oppressive regimes of mullahs in Iran, because it's organizing itself bottom up in a way that it will render the whole state central structure redundant, because people won't need it anymore. People will gradually come to a point to self-govern, and having that flag around or government institutions wouldn't even bother us because we will run our own affairs. And I think if that's possible in an environment where state wants to infiltrate into basically even lives of bedrooms of families in the Middle East, it's very possible in America where privacy is respected, the people come together and start to build this model until a moment where, well, yeah, there's a federal government, but I do 99% of my things through this new model of community organizing, and I don't have any problem having that flag flown here, but I don't really need it. I am self-sufficient. That's really that idea that makes it very attractive, and that makes it very democratic. Like you said, it's called revolution, but it's not a revolution. It's not really toppling anybody. The idea is we're just organizing ourselves into communities that will help the government because we will self-govern. You don't need to make big decisions for us. We're making them for ourselves.
We are running out of time, and before we get to the end here, I think that it would be important for you to tell people kind of how the pandemic has impacted Rojava, what what the people of Rojava are hoping from the transition in presidential regimes here in the United States, and maybe even most importantly, what people here can do to support this important movement.
Yeah, definitely. In terms of pandemic, it start to hit the region really bad. during the last, I would say, month and a half, just like other parts of the world. And a little bit of like the emergency laws and the basically the war situation helps, because people do not really go see each other that often, or they don't leave their own towns because roads are not 100% safe. But still, it's spreading very quickly, and people need a lot of medical needs. And unfortunately, due to embargo on the Syrian government, that's also impacting Rojava, and medical supplies are not arriving timely. So a lot of the Rojava people are dying just because there are not enough units in the hospitals, or not enough respiratory units. So what I will say in terms of help, really people of the region need volunteering doctors or NGOs or teachers, and or public health professionals to provide their help to help alleviate the big problems that the region is going through this medical problem. But also, it's still a war situation. Unfortunately, there are Russian troops, Syrian troops, Turkish troops, jihadis. Like, it's a hodgepodge of things going on there. I don't want to go into detail, but that really requires basically help for a lot of people that are displaced. So basic needs, like Free Burma Rangers, for example, is an NGO that have been very active there. They've been, so, but also there is the Kurdish Red Crescent, which is basically helping every single person in the IDP camps in the region. So depending on who they want to donate, people can donate to these organizations, or go and offer their services even online via Zoom to public health officials, or go volunteer as a teacher or a doctor or a nurse, or whatever services they can render to the region. And in terms of what people are hoping from 2021, and then the changes that are going on in the world in terms of different countries and leadership, especially the United States, what I understand is like the new administration is putting people that are very familiar with the region, like Mr. Blinken as the Secretary of State, or General Lloyd Austin as the Defense Secretary. And President Biden himself, he knows the region really, really well. And so the hope is basically a coherent U.S. policy that is fair and equitable to all parties, that can create sort of at least ability to trade basic needs to the region. When they're short run of grains, that they can do that. When they're short run of the medical supplies, they can do that. So basically, this whole Caesar embargo on Syrian government is crippling the region, and hopefully the new administration will alleviate that for the Rojava region only, so that people can fight against the pandemic and build a happy future for themselves.
Well, thank you so much, Hejar, for that and for being our guest today. I think that this was just, I mean, it's such an important subject for people to know about and to think about, and it's so inspiring. So I really appreciate you taking time to be with us, and I'm looking forward to seeing you at the church when we can gather again in person.
Thank you, Colin.
For our viewers, if you found this video to be helpful, I hope you'll consider joining us for our weekly worship service. We have quite a few things coming up for the winter holiday season. This Sunday, we're having our online Christmas pageant on the 21st at 7 p.m. Central Time. We have an online Zoom worship service for the winter solstice. And then on Christmas Eve, we will have a English language Christmas Eve service at 5 p.m. and then a Spanish language Christmas Eve service at 8 p.m. We'd like to thank our staff for making this video possible. It was produced by Christian Holmes. Alma Viscara assisted with the editing. We'll see you all online soon and in person as soon as we can gather again. And please remember that no matter how isolated you feel, we're all in this together.